Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Fibeable's stream on the French Revolution and Neoclassical Art. My name is Mr. Macklin. I'm a teacher at MSH in Long Island, New York. So remember, think Fibeable, follow Fibeable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So in tonight's stream, what we're going to cover tonight? Tonight, we're going to give just a quick background on the French Revolution in case you missed the Sherry stream, 1789 to 1792, what happened on the State General and so forth. And tonight, we'll talk about how things got moved from the first stage, which was kind of constitutional monarchy, trying to copy maybe the model of the Americas or England, maybe finding a way for Louis XVI to be a part of France, and how we move to the radical phase, kind of like where the stage that, 40, 50,000 people got executed in France. How do we move from the stage? Also, specifically that 10-month period known as the Reign of Terror. Second part of the stream, we'll talk about neoclassical art that emerged during that time, the same time of the French Revolution. And we'll talk specifically about one famous painter who painted the French Revolution and also painted during the era of Napoleon, and his name is Jacques-Louis David. For class purposes, if you just remember the name David, that will be enough. All right, so let's do a quick recap. Let's talk about the liberal phase, 1789 to 1791. As you can see in front of you in this cartoon represents the three estates that dominated French society. We have, of course, the clergy and the nobility, and both of them are riding directly on top about the third estate, which is making around 97% of the population. So 97% of the population in France is represented in the third estate. And then we have the nobility and the clergy who do not pay taxes and are doing very, very well. So this inequality is basically the background to the French Revolution. King Louis XVI France was bankrupt. They needed a way to pay for their finances. So he called this a state general meeting after 150 years when there was no meeting. And during that meeting, basically the third estate demanded more rights. And eventually this basically kicked into what became known as the French Revolution, the attack on the Bastille, and so forth. So that was what happening basically on the first stage of the revolution. You can see this famous cartoon over here, kind of like the third estate is like taking off their shackles and awakening basically. And you can see the clergy and the nobility are basically freaking out and running to save their life. So basically the timeline of the first stage of what is known as like the liberal phase was starting up in 1789 with the meeting of the Estate General, this old body that hasn't met for 150 years, turned out to be that the Third Estate demanded more rights and eventually left the convention and called themselves the National Assembly. And what is known as Independence Day in France is July 14, 1799. That's the day when they storm into the Bastille. And so if you can remember American independence, July 4th, 76, you can remember France is July 14, 1789, the fall of the Bastille. And so basically it's easy also to compare and contrast. It's kind of similar to the beginning, kind of like to the American Revolution. They're thinking about a constitutional monarchy. The National Assembly adopts the Declaration of Rights of Man, which is very similar to the American one, Declaration of Independence. And interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson, who was third president of the United States, actually was in France during that time, and Lafayette, the famous Lafayette, actually asked his help in drafting this Declaration of the Rights of Men. And eventually the Constitution is adopted in 1791. So the first phase of the revolution, it seems like we're going maybe kind of England, kind of America, constitutional monarchy, shared power between the king and the National Assembly. That's the direction that they're heading in. But then things turn. If you're looking for a turning point, it might be the flight to Varennes, when Louis decides to escape from France and actually gets captured and arrested and turned back. That's basically when things turn against Louis, and a lot of the population is very disappointed what kind of a king would leave them. And there was a lot of hatred also to his wife, the foreign wife, who is Austrian. And that also led to the basically to Prussia and Russia to issue the Declaration of Pilance, which they basically pledged to declare war on France if anything would happen to Louis XVI. So that actually even intensified the hatred even more to Louis XVI. Also remember that the emperor, the leader of Austria, is the brother of the Queen of France. So there's a personal connection also that too. And then to make things even more worse, the Duke of Brunswick also basically issues a warning and saying once he reached Paris, if anyone will resist, they're going to be hanged. So France in response basically declares war on Austria, and all of this leads us to the radical phase. So that's a quick overview of basically the liberal phase, how we move from trying to be a constitutional monarchy to a stage where now France is finding itself with war with Austria, and the panic that war is coming to France basically leads France into the next stage. It's the topic of today, which is known as the radical phase, and most famous in it is the Reign of Terror. So any questions up till now? Feel free to drop a question in the question box in the bottom or say hello in the chat room. Any questions up till now? Can you guys hear me pretty well? Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me? All right, let's continue. So let's move about the radical phase. So what do we mean? Hey, thumbs up, very good. So what do we mean when we move to the radical phase? One way of looking at it on the left, anyone recognize the person on the left or the person on the right? Anyone? In the chat box? All right, so anyone taking a push? So, fan, on the left side, did it last year? Yeah, so on the right is Robespierre, very well, Maximilien Robespierre. And on the left, anyone? Okay, so on the left, hint a push, French officer. Who's the most famous French officer ever to come to America? I mentioned his name like 2 minutes ago. Okay, so on the left side, most famous French officer in America, Marquis de Lafayette. So Lafayette, which is kind of like a prominent figure on the first stage, the hero of the American Revolution, comes to France, has a lot of credibility based upon that, kind of tries to put himself to protect the king, but also represents the idea of the revolution. So the radical phase, we're switching from the dominance of Marquis de Lafayette that eventually has to flee from France also to save his life and end up being in jail, but that's a whole other story, to Robespierre that kind of represents the more radical phase and mass execution in France. That's what happened in the second phase. So Robespierre belongs to a debating society, which are called the Jacobins, and they just get their name from, if you can see the picture on the right side, from this old former convent, Jacobin convent. Many famous Jacobins are going to play a very important role in the second phase, the radical phase of the revolution, like Robespierre himself, Georges Danton, Jean-Paul Marat. So we'll work on a little French accent here and there. Sometimes I'm going to mention it in American accent. Sometimes I'm going to try to French it up a little bit. And the Jacobins were originally anti-royalists, but they started to play a very important role in the first, in the creation of the First Republic, basically transitioning France from being a constitutional monarchy to a republic. Now, in the Jacobin also, there's another group called the Girondins, who are also against the monarchy, but are not as well organized as the Jacobins, and turns out later on they're not as radical as they are. So a couple of main members we'll talk about: the Girondins. One of their leaders, Jean-Marie Roland, who played an important role in the first meeting of the convention and spoke against the king treason by basically the flight to Varennes. His wife, Madame Roland, if we need to talk about women in the revolution, also hosts a salon and kind of like the meeting place for the Girondins. And Thomas Paine, who's very famous in American history for writing. Anyone knows Thomas Paine? What did he write? Famous document? Common Sense. Very well. Thomas Paine, who only had 6 people come to his funeral, had a lot of personality problems and had no friends, actually went to France. He loved the revolutions, joined the French Revolution and joined the convention, even though he didn't speak any French. Was welcome originally as a hero and later almost got guillotined himself. But anyway, he also joined on the fractions of the Girondins. Okay. So let's talk about how things got radicalized. So what's the turning point? As we mentioned, one turning point is the fact that the king fled out of France. That made him suspicious by a lot of people who already suspected him based upon his wife, Marie Antoinette, who was seen like as the ultimate Austrian villain, let them eat cake, which he never said. But a lot of people had negative feelings about her. So the turning points, once Louis tries to escape, he basically becomes a prisoner now of the French, the National Assembly. And now with the Duke of Brunswick marching towards Paris, basically panics is setting in. So the Prussians are marching over, and the Duke is threatened that if people resist, that they will die. Then the question happens in early September 1792 is what's going to happen with all the prisoners, all the royalists, all the king's supporter in jail. And that's where some people like Jean-Paul Marat is a very important leader during the French Revolution, basically started to say, maybe instead of allowing them to release them from jail, maybe we should just start killing some of these guys. Sound like a good idea. So that's the first stage where things go from like using some logic and reason, Enlightenment thinking, to radical absolute violence. So it's early September, what is known later as the September Massacre. People basically, the mob going into jail and start just executing variety of people. So we're assuming we don't have exact number, anywhere between 1,300 to 1,500 have been killed. Around 200 of them were priests. There's a lot of hatred also towards the religious authority. So the September Massacre is just one short indication that things are getting out of control in the French Revolution. So again, if you want to compare and contrast, the American Revolution altogether was pretty calm, transitioning from an English monarch to a constitutional monarchy version, American style, replacing a king with President George Washington. But in France, after the first 2 years, things seem to be getting out of control. And it's mainly due to the fear of an invading army coming into France. So the first stage we have is the September Massacre, first indication that things are getting out of control. Now, one group of people are playing an important role in the violence and getting things out of control, who basically invade the assembly and kind of like bully a lot of times the delegates to become more radicalized, is a group called the sans-culottes. So the sans-culottes translate into without breeches. So if you look at the image on the left side over here, the classic way that people used to, high society people, where they used to have like breeches, basically pull their pants up and put like a breech around the knee. And the sans-culottes, you can see on the right, basically are wearing pants, basically the way we wear pants today. So because they kind of represent the working class, the shopkeepers, they get the nickname the sans-culottes, those who don't wear the breeches. And they're more radical, and they're interested in pushing the revolution to more an extreme version. They're not going to settle in constitutional monarchy where King Louis has a certain role. So the sans-culottes are becoming more and more dominating, and the Jacobins, basically the radical Jacobins, are taking advantage of the sans-culottes and basically are making an alliance with them. So it's the sans-culottes and the Jacobins that are turning the revolution more to the radical side. Now, another thing that is interesting, making the instrument of the radicalization and the revolution, is the invention called the guillotine. The guillotine credited incorrectly to Joseph Guillotine, famous doctor. Interestingly enough, even though it's the instrument of killing so many people, it's considered actually an Enlightenment idea. So again, if you remember the context, the French Revolution is influenced by Enlightenment. Anyone know any famous Enlightenment thinkers that influenced the French Revolution? If you were taking the test, if you had an SAQ, if you had to give one example, anyone in the chat, drop us one name of a famous French philosopher who influenced the French Revolution. Rousseau. Okay, best possible example actually is Rousseau. Very good. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is probably the most influential figure to lead to the French Revolution, and his most famous book, The Social Contract, even though he did not invent the concept of the social contract, but his writing. Yes, also John Locke, who influenced the American Revolution, also influenced the French Revolution. But if you want to think also about John Locke kind of influencing maybe the first stage of the French Revolution, the ideas of like the Declaration, the Rights of Man, and talking about a constitutional monarchy, that's kind of like more John Locke, the first stage, more liberal idea. The second stage, if we move into more radical stage, is Rousseau. Rousseau in The Social Contract brings the idea of the general will, the whole idea that sometimes it needs to be done what's good for the country, not just what individual rights. So some people see him as kind of like a socialist, like the father of socialism. So Rousseau plays an important role in the French Revolution, and Robespierre, who was the leader in the radical phase, used to keep a copy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau next to his bed, and always was an ardent supporter of Rousseau and gave him credit to the French Revolution. Anyway, back to the guillotine. So again, it's kind of contradictory to a lot of people, like killing people. That's an Enlightenment idea. But yes, the guillotine was created to create equality. How is the guillotine connected to equality? Historically, most people got killed by violent means, either by still crucifixion, they still crucified people, or burning people and so forth, not to go too much into details. And only the royals had the luxury of having being executed by an axe or a sword. So they felt that the guillotine is going to be like kind of like an equalizer, if you will, that it's going to kill everyone exactly in the same way. Noble people and poor people all are going to be executed in this method. So it's also, if you want to bring scientific into that, is a scientific method because it works 100% of the time. And also, interestingly enough, it was intended to be more humane. And it's interesting because I hear some teachers or some books refer to it as being a humane way to execute people because it's not painful. Which again, I don't know. Nobody came back and told us, was it painful or not painful? But a lot of people assume that it's not painful. I'm one of those people who are not completely sure about that. But anyway, the guillotine became also nicknamed the national razor, became the instrument of making sure that anyone who is fighting to rebel, going against the French Revolution, is going to find his end with this instrument. All right, any questions up till now? All right, let's continue. So let's talk about the trial of Louis XVI. So once it seemed that Louis escaped France and now he was a prisoner, the whole idea, Louis is starting to lose more and more of his power. He's basically, when the revolution started, he's an absolute monarch with all the power. The convention meets, he's stage by stage becoming kind of like a constitutional monarch. And now after the flight of Varennes, some people are questioning, should he be a king at all? And then some people are talking about that maybe he's involved in treason. All of this finally leads Louis in the end of 1792 to be on trial for treason. And actually there was evidence they did show in the trial. It wasn't a complete show trial. They did actually have real evidence that Louis was exchanging letters with the Austrians and basically talking about inviting an army to come over. Granted that most of these ideas came from his wife, Marie Antoinette, Louis was a very indecisive monarch. But in any case, it seems like a few of the butlers talked about that in the palace. There was a place where there was a hole and some letters were there. So Louis must have not treated his workers very well for many of them to come up and give all the details. But in any case, they find a lot of evidence during that trial. And eventually he was found guilty. That's like something that the old delegates very, very quickly decided it was guilty. It was the next stage that, again, if we're moving to more of a radical stage, should the king be executed? And that's a very important split in the Jacobins between the Girondins and the Mountains. The Mountain, not to make things too complicated, are the more radical faction of the Jacobins. There are many, many factions inside the French Revolution, but the more radical side of the Jacobins, known as the Mountain, people like Robespierre and Danton, basically said that, you know, Louis is a traitor and there's always going to be a threat and he needs to be executed. Now, the Girondins say, yes, the king is guilty, but maybe we should, I don't know, just send him to America, remove him from power, but we shouldn't execute him. And by the way, that was like a very interesting vote because every person had to come and say a sentence or two why they're voting that way and state their name and actually vote yes or no. So we know a lot of what each person actually had to say. Robespierre actually made a joke and said, like, I know I'm famous for long speeches, but nobody wants to hear a speech now. He basically made a joke, but nobody was laughing. It's a serious matter. In any case, the king was found guilty by a narrow majority. It wasn't overwhelming. It seems like the Girondins voted against it. People like Thomas Paine voted against it, and that's later what got him into the almost being executed. But the Mountain basically carried the day, and Louis was sentenced to death. And again, the whole, not to go into a lot of details about his execution, people coming to see the King of France being executed, used by the guillotine. It seems like Louis acted with a lot of class and a lot of bravery in the last moments of his life, basically more than he actually ruled. The priest, who was a good friend of him, is supposed to say just before he was executed, screaming in France, worthy son of Saint Louis, ascend into the heaven, hoping that maybe that calmed Louis. And then we can see here in the image the head of Louis XVI. And that, by the way, made shockwaves all around the world about the execution of a king. And that even got more European countries to think that this is getting out of control and they need to put this revolution down. Kind of remember that a lot of European nations in the beginning didn't really care too much if France is getting into a revolution, because France was a very powerful nation. If they're starting a revolution, some countries figured, you know, they're not going to attack. They're going to be weaker, so that's good. But once they executed a king, some other monarchs are thinking, if this revolution ideas are going to come to my country, maybe they're going to think about killing me. So that didn't come off that well. All right. And again, if we're talking about the second stage or the radical stage after the execution of Louis, kind of an executive committee, if you will, basically took over to run France. And they're known, funny enough, by the name the Committee of Public Safety. Yeah, so the organization that was in charge of the mass killing was actually called the Committee of Public Safety. Now, they launched a period known as the Reign of Terror, which lasted around 10 months. So most people think about the French Revolution as being like constant executions, the whole French Revolution. But in reality, it was a period of 10 months with the big fear of the invading army coming into France, and also certain regions of France also rebelling against the French Revolution. So the radical phase was led by Robespierre, who was nicknamed the Sea Green Incorruptible. He was considered like a very frugal and decent person, very meticulous, did not have too many expensive things in his life. Interestingly enough, another interesting story about him, that during the height of the French Revolution, he actually walked back to his house and actually met a carpenter, and the carpenter invited him to his house, and it turns out that the carpenter had a spare room, and Robespierre just rented the spare room from that carpenter and lived with his family for the rest of the revolution. So the leader of the height of the power of France was like living in a carpenter extra rent room. So it just goes to show, not that I'm saying he was a nice guy, he was a horrible person, but it just goes to show that, you know, that it wasn't about money or power, like getting to the top with Robespierre. Now, the Committee of Public Safety basically started to create all these special courts to try many people that they were seen as kind of counter-revolutionary forces, or people are seen supporting of Louis XVI. So if you spoke, if they sensed you were saying something against the revolution, you very, very quickly might find yourself in the guillotine, and that includes men and women. And if we mention women during the French Revolution, is interesting enough, even though we're talking about the Enlightenment. By the way, any questions up till now? I know I'm saying a lot of information tonight, but we're covering two topics in one stream. Any questions up till now? All right, so let's talk women during the revolution. So even though there was a revolution of ideas and talking about equality, it was called the Declaration of the Rights of Men. So they're still not mentioning equality of women during the French Revolution. There were a few salons where women came to discuss topic, like Madame Roland here in the middle actually held the salon and was involved in politics, but altogether women did not have equality during the French Revolution. And some of them, like here on the left, like Olympia de Gouges, wrote a document, Declaration of the Rights of Women, basically kind of like giving a zinger to the whole idea of like, where are women in this document? And also we're going to talk about Charlotte Corday later on, who assassinated a prominent Jacobin leader to put the end to the radical phase of the French Revolution. So many women were involved in talking or writing during the French Revolution, but there was no equality during the French Revolution. And later, when we're going to see some of the art that was created during that time, there was this idea that women are very emotional or out of control, so they cannot be involved in politics. So that's something that only the men can do. So it's kind of a division of the women's sphere, which is kind of like staying home, versus the male sphere, who's being involved in politics or getting elected or vote. Those are things women cannot do. And many of these ideas, by the way, are given, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about them, proving these theories. I'm saying prove in quotation mark, in books such as Emile, when he talked about the women should basically stay home and the politics should be the business of men. Also Mary Wollstonecraft in England wrote in support of the French Revolution and attacked people like English authors that spoke against it. All right. Also later on, of course, Marie Antoinette, not long after Louis XVI, also found herself being executed. The famous painter we're going to talk in the second part, Jacques-Louis David, did this sketch of her. He actually didn't finish the painting. See, like they cut their hair. So tragic ending for Marie Antoinette and tragic ending for Louis XVI, and both of them executed in the radical phase of the French Revolution. So let's talk about, other than the mass killing, what kind of reforms that they wanted to do in France. They wanted to create, question, how many people were killed in the Reign of Terror? So estimation, anywhere between 40 to 50,000 people have died in the Reign of Terror. Now, again, you might open many books about the French history revolution, and you're going to see a variety of numbers. Some people estimated it's almost some people have actually seen some books saying 100,000, and some people said up to 20,000. It's not just the people who got killed in the guillotine. Some people got killed by in battlefields. There's many ways to count this, but altogether we can assume something 40 to 50,000 people have been killed, my best estimation, in that 10 period of known as the Reign of Terror. And also, if you take AP Europe, you should also think about it. What doing All right, sorry, we had a little technical difficulty here. Let's try to do this again. So I'm just going to put the slide back up again. Oops, sorry. Stay with me 1 second. Let's try it one more time. Sorry, folks. So we're going live, so this thing is live. One more try. All right, there we go. All right. Okay, here we're back. All right, let's continue. So where were we? Last thing we talked about was reforms. Okay. So let's continue in talking about reforms. So some of the more radical reforms we have during that time, for example, is bread of equality. For example, like they pass a law that you can't produce white bread, you can only produce brown bread. White bread, by the way, interesting enough, is kind of like a rich people's bread. So they disallow that. We also have a de-Christianization in France during that time. So again, Robespierre and his supporters are seeing Christianity as anti-Enlightenment. So Christianity is basically destroyed during that time. They think about it as a superstition, and they kind of try to change everything. Like streets that have the name saints are banned. Churches are kind of converted into kind of like more of like Enlightenment shrines. Instead of worshiping God, they worship reason, like Notre Dame Cathedral is called the Temple of Reason. So there's they create all these festivals to kind of celebrate kind of more secular idea versus religion. And also in the economy, they're doing kind of a planned economy, which basically they control the production of things, kind of like more socialist way, what to produce, how much to produce, and kind of set prices in that capacity. So kind of like celebrations, like they have this big festival, kind of like where they're celebrating reason. This is where kind of probably Robespierre made a wrong turn in history when he kind of like dressed like as a Roman god, and they built this mountain, and he kind of came down from that mountain wearing kind of like this halo, and that's when people are like, who does this guy think he is? So this is where kind of Robespierre pushed it. Robespierre really believed in virtue, that good French people are controlled by their virtues. That's a big obsession that he had. So this festival of the supreme being, which again is kind of like a replacement of God, or like reasons, worshiping reasons, was a big thing. They kind of also changed all the calendars during that time, so all the names, trying to take Christianity away from everything, taking all the Christian holidays, taking all Saturday doesn't exist. So all these months are based upon seasons, or kind of like logical things. So trying to stop the reign of terror, we have here on the left side a very famous woman in the French Revolution, Charlotte Corday. She decided that the reign of terror needs to stop, and she needs to do something about it. So on the right here, one of the most radical Jacobins, his name was Jean-Paul Marat. He had a newspaper which was nicknamed the Friend of the People, funny enough, and in it he basically denounced certain people that needed to be killed. Now, he had a physical condition that he had a lot of scabs on his body, so he needed to basically most of the day stay in his bathtub in hot water. That's the only thing that relieved his pain. So in that tub, he basically sat all day long and made lists of enemies everywhere. It's probably a very paranoid person. So she decided, in order to stop the terror, that she needs to assassinate and kill him. So she basically got a knife, traveled to Paris, found where he lives, knocked on the door, did not make it on the first time, but on the second time, she managed to come upstairs, claimed that she has a list of people that needed to be killed. Marat said, leave it on the table. I guarantee they'll be all killed tomorrow. She took a knife and she stabbed, hoping to stop the reign of terror. By the way, she didn't run away. She just stayed on the scene, and she said it very calmly that, I killed them in order to stop the craziness of the French Revolution. And again, she was seen as this great terrorist, basically, and Marat was seen as this poor saint. And she was guillotined 4 days later. Now, the famous painter, we're going to talk in the next section, Jacques-Louis David painted this famous painting called The Death of Marat. And in it, we're seeing Marat is elevated kind of to a Christian saint. You see him, poor Marat, sitting here, on his death, basically. By the way, that painting is also inaccurate because he's very clean, and Marat himself was hideous because he had all these scabs on his body. And by the way, over here you can see on the right side, that's David is showing us the letter that she gave him, and all the like how she deceived Paul Marat. On the floor here, we're seeing the knife that he had. And also interesting, also something incorrect here, we're seeing like a letter and money that Marat is contributing to the poor. And interesting also, it's kind of like on the right side here, it says Marat and it says David on the bottom. So David is actually showing us that he painted this. So it's kind of like an homage to Marat. So Marat is kind of becoming like the new, basically like Jesus. He's been crucified for the sin of the Republic. Later on, things changed in French history, and they understood that Marat was like this terrorist guy, and Corday was a hero, but at that moment she was seen as the villain. Also, nationalism is very, very high in France. A lot of the symbols that we know of France today are created during the French Revolution. Of course, the French flag, the tricolor, is built during that time, taking the red and blue, which are the colors of Paris, combined with white, which is the color of the monarchy, and that's how we get the French flag. The Marseillaise, the French anthem. See how I butchered that word. The national anthem is written by a French army officer to motivate soldiers to fight. The song talks about killing, negative stuff, but that's a whole other story. But it's supposed to inspire people to fight. We have the French national motto over here, credited to Robespierre. Some people dispute that. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, or in French, watch me butcher it, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And by the way, the original thing also said mort, or death, but they took the death out. So now that becomes the motto of France: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And also the famous French cap that you might see sometimes to this day in some demonstrations in America. You can see it on top over here. And also in our national symbol, there's also a red cap on the top. Shout out to French. So how did the Reign of Terror finally end? So the killing of Marat did not actually finish the Reign of Terror as Corday wanted. The Reign of Terror eventually ended. First, the Girondins started to be killed because Robespierre and his supporters felt the Girondins were kind of traitors because they wanted to go easy on the king, and the Girondins tried to stop the mass execution. So Robespierre and his supporters are saying these guys are not really revolutionaries. So many Girondins started to be killed themselves. And that's where some people in the mountain and the Jacobin side, like downtown, basically said, okay, we need to stop the killing. Actually, in that stage, France's economy was doing a little bit better. They managed to push away some of the invading armies. So there was if the terror was justified out of the paranoia that the armies are coming in, now things were calming down. But still, Robespierre still wanted believe that the killing needs to happen. So when Danton basically said, we need to stop the execution, Robespierre basically said, only criminals are asking for mercy on behalf of criminals. So basically, Danton was also sent to the guillotine. Famous last word, he basically predicted that Robespierre is going to follow him. He said, like, he basically said something like, my only regret is like that I'm not going to see that weasel Robespierre being executed, but that's going to happen soon, which he was totally correct. But Robespierre took over the Committee of Public Safety, and the execution continue. However, the official end of the Reign of Terror is when Robespierre played his card the wrong way. What was known as one of the months that was named during the time Thermidorian month was the Thermidorian reaction, when Robespierre every night went and gave speeches in the convention about the traitors, who's going to be killed. One of his last speeches turned out to be one of his worst moves. He actually said that there are some traitors that we're going to have to deal with, but he didn't give any names. Didn't give any names. Big mistake. We're going to say some people are going to need to be killed, but you don't say which people. That made a lot of people suspicious in the audience, and that's where some of them decided, okay, we need to finish this guy. That's how things turns against Robespierre, and eventually they decided to arrest him. Soldiers came in, fired a bullet into his face, and he was finished off the next day in the guillotine. So this is one of this painting of him like lying down in agony with that bullet in his face, and that's how the Reign of Terror was finished, with the killing of Robespierre. So that's basically how the Reign of Terror ended. And next week, we'll talk about how Napoleon basically came into that vacuum. After the end of the Reign of Terror, there's going to be like 5 years of Directory, which 5 dictators are going to combine power, and then Napoleon is going to swoop in 1799. So that's next week's stream. Whatever time we have left, we're going to talk a little bit about neoclassical art. Any questions up to now? Right, so let's talk about neoclassical art. And by the way, last year in the exam, the SAQ had a question about neoclassicism. They actually had an image of neoclassical art. So identifying it would have been very helpful for anyone last year to get the credit. So neoclassical art. So if you followed the last streams, I did a stream about the Baroque art. So in AP Europe up till now, you should have probably covered the Renaissance, Mannerism, Baroque art, and the last one was the Rococo, which also comes from France. So neoclassical is around 1780 to 1820. So it's around the French Revolution. It happens during the French Revolution, so the origins are in France. The historical context happens during the French Revolution. There's many Enlightenment ideas also being brought in. And looking back into Roman and Greek time, and also archaeological mania is kind of bursting into the scene. That's the time also that they rediscover Pompeii. So there's a lot of interest going back to Roman and Greek times. So kind of like the buzzwords, the main words, if you want to remember about neoclassicism, that the paintings are about order, about calm. There's also an Enlightenment idea of rationality in the painting. They're supposed to be inspirational, to uplift people. And if you remember David as being the main painter of this period, you're pretty much set. So neoclassicism is basically a reaction against the decadence or the fun of Rococo. Because if you study Rococo, which is the art movement, dominant art movement before neoclassicism, was all about like these fluffy colors and aristocrats playing outdoors and all these pink colors. So neoclassicism, which was not called neoclassicism, it was created, it was actually nicknamed True Style, kind of reflects Enlightenment idea, and and the paintings are all about reason and order and logic. They're all about simplicity, and there's perfect symmetry in them, straight lines. and it kind of replaces all the curvedness and the Rococo staircase. Everything is curved. In Neoclassicism, everything is organized. And it's meant to inspire, to uplift people. If the context is during the French Revolution, it's all about civic virtue. That's the ideas that they're trying to give to the people during the French Revolution. And one way to look at it is looking back into Greek society and Roman society that are so inspirational. So if you kind of studied already in the beginning of the year Renaissance is looking back into classical time, Roman and Greeks. Then we have all these new movements. So now Neoclassicism is again looking backward into the Greeks and the Roman to get inspiration. Now, the main painter, if you want to remember for this period, is of course Jacques-Louis David. Now, interestingly enough, he wasn't just some other painter. He was actually a Jacobin. He was involved in the French Revolution. He was a close friend of Robespierre. Even said, like, just before Robespierre got killed, I'm on your side, I'll be with you all the way through. The next day when Robespierre got chopped, he disappeared, but he actually supported him to the end. He actually even voted for the beheading of the king, and he actually signed the deaths of other people. So this guy was involved in politics. He wasn't just like a painter on the side, but he was inspired by the Greeks and the Romans. He was very inspired when he went on a trip to Italy and kind of like changed his whole style of painting, kind of transitioning from Rococo to this new art movement that he basically helped to create, Neoclassicism, and started to change his topics to paint more historical figures from ancient history. And he kind of became like the main painter of the French Revolution. Most of the most iconic paintings from the French Revolution and from the Napoleon period are painted by David, and he painted many portraitures of also the main leaders of the French Revolution, like we talked about already Marat, we talked about Marie Antoinette, and to name a few. Also created some costumes for the Revolution. He lived almost all of his life in France. Just the last stages after Napoleon has been replaced, he's going to go into exile and finish his life in Brussels. Also, a little bit about his face. If some people are wondering, over here, he was involved in a duel and got a slash in his face. So he had difficulty talking, so he had to express himself more in painting. So let's just go over a couple of his main paintings, and then we'll talk about some architecture. So the death of Socrates. So of course, if we talk about classical time, no bigger famous philosopher is this Socrates, or if you know the whole story told as it's told by Plato, talking about how Socrates, rather than escape his death, decided to stay with courage. And here we're seeing he's taking the hemlock and drinking to his death. Look, notice how erect he is, standing physically up high. Plato is actually sitting here on the left, even though Plato was a young man. Here is portrayed as an old man. So again, notice the clear background, the clear colors. Socrates should have been an older man. This painting is actually showing him a lot more younger than he actually was. In the background, we're seeing Socrates' wife leaving the scene. So the death of Socrates, 1787, just before the French Revolution. Now, this is the famous, probably the most famous painting of Neoclassicism, the Oath of the Horatii, in 1784, before the French Revolution. And it kind of like evokes all the classical feature of Neoclassicism, self-sacrifice, order, inner strength, devotion to duty. Not to go too much to the story behind this, but we've seen the father basically with the Roman, these three soldiers are going to go and fight the Horatii, and they're actually saluting over here and swearing allegiance, and the father is holding the swords. By the way, this salute later on is adopted by Nazis. Fascists really like this salute. So it's actually an original Roman thing, this kind of the salute. So all of this is very, very here. But again, if we talked about the spheres, this is the male sphere, and this is the women's sphere. Notice the men are standing, they're erect. The posture here, the triangle, devotion to duty. Women are over here on this side are seen very weak, like they cannot handle this action, this fighting. So they're like curved while the men are erect. And again, I'm just a messenger, don't shoot me. I'm just telling you the way they saw things during that time. So the Oath of the Oration, when this painting was showed for the first time in the Salon, it created a lot of big sensation and kind of put David on the map. I actually put one of the links to this stream has a video that talks a little bit more about this painting. Brutus and the bodies of his son. So another famous painting when we talk about sacrifice here, the famous Brutus, not the Brutus that stabbed Julius Caesar, but the ancestor of that Brutus just before that. It's a whole other story. Actually, when we talk about sacrifice, when we talk about devotion to the cause, he's willing to have his son die rather than having Rome be ruled by monarchy. So again, notice the women's sphere, again, crying emotion, while Brutus is, again, stoic, erect, not showing his emotion. In the background, we're seeing the bodies of his sons, but he's basically decided to look away. The only thing that we've seen some emotion or some conflict is the way he's crossing his legs in the bottom. That's the only symbol that we can see that he's finding it hard. He's not completely made out of stone, but the fact that he's willing to sacrifice everything for the Republic, for the good of the Republic, that's the kind of the ideals that the paintings during that time were created. The women are crying, they're being emotional, while the male sphere is dominant. And notice all the time the paintings are divided into two parts, the women's sphere and the male sphere. That's something you can write if you get an essay about male and females on the 18th century. Definitely you can mention the male sphere and the women's sphere, and mention Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course. Let's keep on going. The tennis court oath, which David painted. This is the story during the French Revolution when the king basically closed the palace for the state generals. They got kicked out. They decided that they will stay in the tennis court and will not leave it until they write a constitution to France. David painted this painting. We can see all three of the estates, the three groups, the priests, the clergy, the third estate, and the nobility together are holding here a lot of screaming and energy. And in the center of the painting, the mayor of Paris issuing the oath. Many of these people actually got killed, so this painting was never completed. A lot of paintings were not completed because many people got killed as the revolution continued. If you see an image of this with more colors, that's not the way it was painted. This is the original. The death of Marat, which we mentioned earlier on, but interesting, just compare and contrast that we have the historical Jesus, kind of this Pieta over here by Michelangelo. Jesus is being the martyr of the cause, and now a secular martyr in Jean-Paul Marat. So that's kind of like the ideals of the French Revolution coming into fruition. Napoleon crossing the Alps. Like next week, we'll talk about some of the most iconic paintings of Napoleon done by Jacques-Louis David, making him kind of like a hero on top of the horse, which is not historically accurate either. So that's about painting. If you remember, Jean-Jacques Louis David is probably the main painter that you want to remember. Now, architecture. Architecture is kind of like what you can see most of architecture in America. For example, if you look around the US, like, the Supreme Court or, the White House, that's basically neoclassicism. So again, it's all about rational, sensible, simple, like long columns to kind of contradict all the frivolous colors of the Rococo. So it's everything organized, a lot of domes on the architecture. Another example how things are transitioning in France, the Pantheon in France, which is kind of like copying the Pantheon in Roman, the Roman version, was kind of intended to be like a Jesuit church, but was given kind of like a secular purpose and becoming a place, kind of a mausoleum, a place where all the founding father of the French Revolution are going to be buried. So this is where they brought people like Marat, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau to be buried. So a transition from a place where you worship, again, Christian saints. This is a place now you're going to worship revolutionary martyrs of the cause or philosophers. These are the people that you should be worshiping. So that's another example. And the building, of course, giving us all the classic features of neoclassical art. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris, again, one of the big symbols of Paris, also very classical, neoclassical imagery. So, and again, even though the movement is ends on the early, after like 50 years after it started, like in the 1820s, there's a continuation in the 19th century of many, many other buildings that the influence of neoclassicism goes beyond that period of time, like Buckingham Palace, if you will, is kind of neoclassical. The Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Over here in the bottom, I did not forget to write the name. Anyone can recognize what is this in the bottom here? What is this place over here? Anyone visited? It's in the US. Anyone? Look at the columns, you can count them. All right, so that's the Lincoln Memorial. All right, very good. Supreme Court. Yeah, the Lincoln Memorial. But these buildings are very, very similar. Almost all of Washington, D.C. is designed kind of like neoclassical art. Our founding fathers were very, very interested in what's going to take a push next year. Our founding fathers are very, very big fans of Rome. So next week, we will be covering Napoleon Bonaparte, and we're going to talk about how he kind of is seen as the person who finished the French Revolution, but some people are saying maybe, you know, he brought the ideals of the French Revolution to other places. So it's kind of like a debate, but for all intents and purposes, the French Revolution is seen most history books, 1789 to 1799, finish it with Napoleon taking over. So Q&A, question time. All right. Any questions that we have? All right, let's see what we have here. What did Danton do? Okay, so Georges Danton was early on one of the first best outspoken people that speak on the first stages of the revolution. He's one of the first public speakers to talk about the ideals of the French Revolution, to speak directly against the king. And as the revolution continued, he became one of the leaders of the Jacobin movements and became one of the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. And the fact that he spoke against Robespierre was kind of like the last stages of Robespierre. He was a lot more popular than Robespierre, and a lot of people saw it in a tragic way that he got executed the way he did. But then again, many other Jacobins got killed. So he's an important figure if you want to remember for test purposes. But I think Robespierre, if you remember his name, you'll be good for the test. Any other question? All right. I thought women got closer to equality in the revolution, and Napoleon took some of the rights back away. Okay, so altogether, women did not advance in the French Revolution altogether. They did not get the right to vote. They did not get any special privileges. They did host some salons, and there were a few female clubs. But also in the Reign of Terror, there was a push to stop women and to stop these groups. And all the females that I mentioned up till now, all of them got guillotined during the French Revolution. So Madame Roland, Corday, what else did I put? Olympia de Gouges, all of these women got executed. So altogether, we can say that women did not advance in the French Revolution. Napoleon came and actually did strip away some of what he perceived that women got equality, but he actually wrote more laws to even make it worse for them. So you can actually, I'm not sure if it's necessarily that Napoleon came over and took the rights of women. He just perceived that they got too many rights, so he had to take even more. He just put a very more organized law system to make sure that women, that male is still the dominant force. So Or maybe another way of looking at the fear was because of the French Revolution that women will think that they deserve more equality. So Napoleon came over and decided even to take whatever they did have and took even more. But altogether, I would not say women got too much equality during this war. Any other questions? All right. So if there's no more questions for today, also, let me see if I have here. Also for resources, if you're interested in a couple more books, a couple emails, people texted me a couple of books about the French Revolution. Viva la Revolution by Mark Steele he's actually a stand-up comedian. So it's a very funny book about the French Revolution. Very interesting. So you can get a laugh, a little stand-up comedy, and learn about the French Revolution. It's a very funny and interesting book. And if you're looking for like an easy read about the French Revolution, is a couple of versions of this book by Norwich, John Jules Norwich, History of France. I think that's the way it was published in the U.S. In Europe, I got it. It was called From Gaul to the Gaul. So whatever version you find, Norwich. A very easy read about the history, all of history of France, not just about the French Revolution. And if you're super intellectual, you want to read a lot about the French Revolution, studied it in college, Simon Schama, The French Revolution is probably the best book about the French Revolution. So if there's no more questions, thank you all for joining me tonight. And I hope to see you all next week and same time, 9 p.m. And we'll have a stream about Napoleon. So have a great night, everyone. Thanks for joining. See you next week. Bye.